Echoes of the Gold Coast, a journey through time, long before the crashing waves of the Atlantic kissed the ships of Portuguese explorers, before maps bore the name Gold Coast, and long before colonizers drew lines to define territory, this land, rich, fertile, and vibrant, was home to a thriving tapestry of civilizations. To understand the Gold Coast, we must step into the age before gold became its defining feature. This was a land shaped by its rivers and forests, governed by ancestral spirits and sacred traditions, and ruled not by a single king, but by the customs of many tribes. The earliest settlers. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest known settlers of what would later become the Gold Coast were the Guan people. Oral traditions speak of their arrival from the north around the 1st millennium AD, long before other major ethnic groups made their way into the region. The Guans were not a centralized people, but rather scattered into various pockets, forming small communities and towns. Some settled along the Black Volta, others near the Afram Plains, and a few along the hilly Aquapim-Togo ranges. Their way of life was heavily reliant on subsistence farming, hunting, fishing, and gathering. Though their political systems were relatively decentralized, spiritual life and kinship bonds were strong. Every hill, tree, and river was believed to be inhabited by a spirit, Abasum, that could bless or curse. The Guans worshipped their gods through libation, animal sacrifice, and festivals celebrating harvests or ancestral heroes. Over time, other ethnic groups arrived. Akan migrants moved from the Sahelian regions, that likely pushed by ecological pressures and conflicts. They were followed by Yu settlers and later the Gadangme and Mole Dagbani peoples. Each group brought with them languages, customs, and a worldview that would slowly mesh with those of existing inhabitants or clash with them in territorial disputes. The Akan expansion. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the Akan groups had firmly rooted themselves in the central forest belt. The Akan migration is often traced back to the Bono Kingdom, believed to be one of the earliest Akan states, which formed in the area near modern-day Brong-Ahafo. The Bono were organized with a complex political system, a ruling king, or Omanhen, and an advisory council of elders. The Akan expansion led to the formation of powerful states like Denkira, Akyem, Asin, and later the formidable Ashanti Empire. These states were not isolated. They traded amongst themselves, warred, intermarried, and exchanged cultural practices. Despite occasional battles, there existed an understanding that identity was layered. One could be Ashanti and still identify as Akan. Shared language and customs provided a cultural umbrella. With time, these societies developed strong institutions. Chieftaincy structures emerged, supported by stools as sacred symbols of authority. These stools were not merely seats. They were seen as the embodiment of the soul of a people. To sit on a stool was to sit on the shoulders of ancestors. Before the spread of Christianity or Islam, the spiritual landscape of the Gold Coast was vast and deeply rooted. Each ethnic group had its own pantheon of gods, spirits, and lesser deities. Among the Akan, Niema, the sky god, was the supreme being, but lesser gods like Tano, Buzumtwi, and Essi handled earthly affairs. The Yu worshipped Mawu, and among the Ga, Nai was revered as a principal sea deity. These deities were venerated in sacred groves, shrines, and rivers. Priests and priestesses served as mediums, capable of interceding with the gods. They led purification rites, prescribed herbal medicines, and mediated community disputes. Social structure was also highly organized. Kinship was central. Most Akan societies were matrilineal, meaning inheritance and identity flowed through the mother's line. This gave women significant power in domestic and spiritual spheres, though men often held chieftaincy titles. Art, music, and storytelling were essential cultural pillars. Drumming was more than entertainment. It was communication. Drum languages conveyed messages during war, funerals, or festivals. Kente weaving, wood carving, and goldsmithing were already emerging as high forms of craftsmanship, valued both for beauty and symbolism. Economy and trade networks. The ancient Gold Coast was not economically dormant before European contact. Internal trade routes connected the forest belt to the savanna and beyond. Northern traders, often associated with Wangara or Mande routes, brought salt, kola nuts, and leather. In return, forest dwellers provided gold dust, ivory, pepper, and cloth. Markets like those at Begho, Salaga, and Kintampo buzzed with activity, their stalls brimming with goods and tongues speaking different dialects. Gold, in particular, played a significant role in pre-colonial commerce. Mined from riverbeds and underground shafts, it was panned or extracted using iron tools and passed along trade routes heading north towards Mali and Songhai. Even before the Portuguese set eyes on it, the gold from this region had reached as far as the Mediterranean and Middle East via trans-Saharan caravans. Indeed, it was tales of this gold, tales of cities that gleamed, of kings who dined off golden platters, that spurred interest from European powers. Unlike the image of chaotic tribalism often projected by colonial writers, the political systems of the pre-Gold Gold Coast were complex and deeply respected. Power was not seized lightly. Among the Akon, the process of installment was sacred. Chiefs were selected by queen mothers, endorsed by councils, and installed through ceremonies that invoked the ancestors. Checks and balances existed. Chiefs could be destooled if they violated customs or lost the trust of the people. Councils of elders, asafo companies, traditional warrior groups, and religious authorities served as informal branches of governance. In the north, the Moldagbani states had kings known as Yana or Nairi, who presided over vassal chiefs and maintained alliances through marriage and diplomacy. The concept of communalism thrived. Land was owned collectively by clans and stewarded by lineage heads. Resources were shared, disputes mediated, and decisions made by consensus where possible. Festivals and cultural unity. Pre-colonial life was not all work and war. It was also a celebration of life and spirit. Each ethnic group had its own calendar of festivals, celebrated with dance, music, drumming, food, and storytelling. These were times of reunion, remembrance, and renewal. The Homowo Festival of the Ga, celebrating a historical famine and its eventual relief, remains one of the oldest in the southern regions. The Abokir Festival of the people of Winneba celebrated ancestral migration and bravery, while the Ade festivals of the Ashanti honored the spirits of ancestors. Through such celebrations, oral history was preserved. Griots and elders recited proverbs, sung dirges, and recounted the deeds of kings and heroes. Children sat around fires to hear Ananse stories, morality tales woven around a clever spider that remains iconic even today. A land prepared by time. By the end of the 15th century, the people of the Gold Coast had built societies that were complex, layered, and dynamic. They had not waited for the European to civilize them. They had their own systems of law, worship, diplomacy, and trade. They understood the rhythms of the land, the flooding of rivers, the migration of birds, the healing power of herbs. They had names for every moon cycle, methods for forecasting rains, and traditions for celebrating each season. The land was not silent. It sang with the laughter of children, the chants of farmers, the rhythms of artisans, and the wisdom of griots. So when, in 1471, the first Portuguese ships appeared on the horizon, they did not discover an empty land. They arrived at a place already breathing with history. Part 2. First Glimpse of Strangers. Echoes of the Gold Coast, a journey through time. The year was 1471, and the shores of the Gulf of Guinea were shimmering under the intense West African sun. The waves roared like ancient drums, crashing with rhythmic grace against the coastline. Fishermen from Elmina and surrounding settlements, with nets over their shoulders and paddles in hand, noticed something odd on the horizon. At first, they mistook it for a mirage. Long, towering wooden structures gliding effortlessly across the sea, propelled by white cloths that danced in the wind. But this was no trick of the light. These were the ships of the Portuguese, the first Europeans to lay eyes on the Gold Coast. What followed would be the beginning of over 400 years of transformation, exploitation, resistance, and resilience. But in that first moment, when foreign sails pierced the sky and unknown languages met the ears of the people, what was most present was not fear. It was curiosity. The arrival of the Portuguese. The arrival of João de Santarém and Pedro Escobar, Portuguese navigators under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, marked a seismic shift in the story of the Gold Coast. Driven by the desire to find new trade routes, access gold at its source, and spread Christianity, the Portuguese expedition found what they had only heard in whispers from trans-Saharan traders, an abundance of gold. They anchored near El Mina, then known to the locals as Anamansa, meaning the perpetual drink due to its proximity to a river and abundance of fresh water. Upon landing, the Portuguese made cautious contact with local leaders. The exchange was tentative. No one knew what to expect. But both parties shared a common interest: trade. The locals presented gold dust, ivory, and cola nuts. The Portuguese offered copper, mirrors, beads, cloth, and ironware. These initial interactions were peaceful, almost ceremonial. For the people of Anamansa, it was not their first time encountering foreign merchants. Trans-Saharan traders from Mali, Wangara, and the desert lands had long made their way south. But these men came by sea, spoke in strange tongues, and carried crosses of metal. To the Portuguese, this land was a dream. In their records, they referred to it as Mina de Ouro, the mine of gold. This name would eventually be shortened and transformed into Elmina, which would become one of the most important towns in the colonial narrative of Ghana. Elmina, castle, fortress of fortune and chains. By 1482, barely a decade after that first encounter, the Portuguese returned with more than goods. This time they brought laborers, architects, masons, and armed guards. Their mission: to build a permanent structure to control the trade of gold and protect their interests from other European rivals who were beginning to sail down the West African coast. They chose Elmina as the site and constructed São Jorge da Mina, or Elmina Castle, the first European building in sub-Saharan Africa. From the outside, it looked like a fortress of power and wealth, with towers, thick walls, and flagpoles bearing the cross of Portugal. But its foundation was laid on fragile diplomacy and the silent tensions that had begun brewing between locals and foreigners. While local leaders initially agreed to the Portuguese presence, seeing it as a way to access new wealth and foreign products, they quickly realized that the fort wasn't just a warehouse. It was a symbol of occupation. It was fortified, controlled by foreign soldiers, and regulated who could trade and at what price. What began as a partnership quickly evolved into dominance. The Portuguese had come for gold, and gold they took. Tons of it. Elmina became a central hub in a trade network that stretched from Europe to the Americas. In exchange, the people of the Gold Coast received goods that dazzled the eye: glassware, firearms, liquor, but slowly corroded traditional systems of wealth and exchange. Cultural collision and curiosity. While economics played a central role in the early contact, cultural curiosity was inevitable. The locals were fascinated by the Portuguese attire, their pale skin, and their religious rituals. The ringing of church bells, the burning of incense, and the sight of robed priests making the sign of the cross seemed both strange and powerful. The Portuguese, for their part, were intrigued by the complex social structures they encountered. They were surprised by the political organization of the Akan states, the reverence for ancestral spirits, and the importance of stools in governance. Some missionaries attempted to convert locals, offering education in Portuguese and Christianity. A few elites even sent their sons to Lisbon to be trained in European fashion and belief, hoping this would strengthen ties and open new doors. But for all the cultural exchanges that occurred, mistrust simmered beneath the surface. Language barriers led to miscommunication. Deals made in haste sparked accusations of betrayal. And as more ships arrived, bringing more goods and more soldiers, the people of the Gold Coast began to ask an important question. Were these strangers here as guests, or something else? Rise of rivalries and the impact on kingdoms. As the Portuguese established a foothold along the coast, their presence began to shift the balance of power among the local kingdoms. Chiefs who had direct access to European goods gained an upper hand in regional disputes. States like Aquamu, Denkyira, and Fante formed strategic relationships with the newcomers, exchanging gold and loyalty for firearms and influence. However, this external influence also bred internal rivalries. Disputes over who controlled the goldfields and the right to trade with Europeans led to wars. Firearms, once foreign, became common tools of conflict, and traditional warfare became bloodier and more destructive. Over time, this access to foreign weapons began to reshape local politics. Kingdoms that once relied on diplomacy and lineage were now ruled by those who could afford to buy the most guns. The introduction of European metal goods undermined local craftsmanship, and imported liquor began to alter the rhythm of social life in many communities. The arrival of strangers, once viewed with wonder, began to cast a shadow. The role of religion and resistance. The Portuguese were not content with trade alone. They were missionaries of empire, sent to spread the gospel as much as to gather gold. In several coastal settlements, they built chapels and sent priests to preach the Christian faith. Some chiefs tolerated this, even entertained it, especially when it brought political or economic advantage. A few converted more for diplomacy than devotion. But many resisted. Traditional spiritual beliefs remained strong. The gods of the land were not so easily displaced. Priests and priestesses, custodians of ancestral spirits, warned of dangers to come. Stories began to circulate in towns and villages. Stories of foreign powers who came not just for gold, but for domination. Elders whispered that accepting the strangers without caution would one day bring sorrow. And though the Portuguese had not yet begun the transatlantic slave trade in earnest, seeds of resistance were already planted in the soil. In time, these whispers would turn into rebellion. More strangers on the horizon. The Portuguese had barely settled into Elmina when whispers of other European powers started to grow louder. The Dutch, hearing of Portugal's fortunes on the Gold Coast, began launching their own expeditions. In the early 1600s, they would eventually challenge Portuguese control and seize Elmina Castle in Saddle 1637. But that chapter was yet to unfold. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, it was still the Portuguese who ruled the seas, and the Gold Coast was their prize. They mapped the coastline, named rivers and towns in their own tongue, and boasted in Lisbon's royal court of the new world they had found. Yet behind the maps and trade ledgers, something deeper was brewing, an unspoken understanding that the arrival of the white sails had changed everything. The Gold Coast was no longer just a land of kingdoms and spirits. It was now a land of interest for the world beyond. The first glimpse of strangers had come and gone, and the land would never be the same again. Next, from trade to chains. The breeze along the Gold Coast was changing, still salty and warm, but now carrying whispers of fear and confusion. It had started with beads, mirrors, and cloth. Then it became muskets and gunpowder, and soon it would become chains. The peaceful exchange of goods between the people of the Gold Coast and the Portuguese had been laced with smiles and gestures of goodwill. But beneath the surface, a more sinister transaction was taking shape. One that would reshape the very soul of West Africa. By the early 1500s, the demand for African labor in European colonies across the Atlantic was growing. Portugal had discovered fertile sugar plantations on islands like São Tomé and Príncipe, and labor was scarce. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were already perishing under disease and cruelty. The European eye, greedy and calculating, turned toward Africa, not as a partner, but as a reservoir of human bodies to be sold, shipped, and shackled. The Gold Coast before the chains. Before the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade took root, the societies along the Gold Coast were vibrant and highly organized. Towns and villages bustled with activity. Markets were alive with voices, traders bartering over yams, kente cloth, ivory, and, of course, gold. Each ethnic group, from the Akan to the Ga, Iu, and Zema, had its own customs, spiritual beliefs, and systems of governance. The Akan states, including powerful kingdoms like Denkira, Akwamu, and Asante, flourished through gold mining, farming, and internal trade. Political power was decentralized but respected, rooted in chieftaincy and clan-based authority, often passed through the maternal line. Among these peoples, honor, family, and land were sacred. But slowly, these values would be tested by the foreign concept of slavery, not as punishment, debt, or war retribution as had been occasionally practiced, but as mass export for profit. Portuguese exploitation and the shift. The Portuguese initially showed restraint, preferring to avoid disrupting their gold supply. They relied on diplomacy, gifts, and alliances with local leaders. However, as the market for enslaved Africans exploded in Brazil and the Caribbean, priorities shifted. The Portuguese began purchasing captives, first as an extension of local conflicts. Chiefs would sometimes hand over prisoners of war or criminals in exchange for guns, liquor, or cloth. But as demand increased, so did temptation. European traders, driven by insatiable greed, began incentivizing war encouraging rival kingdoms to attack their neighbors. Tribes that had lived in relative peace suddenly found themselves dragged into endless cycles of violence. The wars were no longer about territory or revenge. They were about capturing the young and the strong, binding their hands and delivering them to foreign ships. What had begun as simple trade now had a human price. The rise of slave ports. By the mid-1500s, Elmina Castle, once built for gold, was quietly repurposed. Deep inside its thick walls, dungeons were carved out, damp and windowless, where hundreds of Africans would be crammed for days or weeks before the ships arrived. These were not prisons for justice, they were warehouses for people. The door of no return became a silent witness to countless tragedies. Families torn apart, children ripped from their mothers, lovers separated forever. Many of those imprisoned had never even seen the sea before. They wept, sang, prayed, or stared blankly, unable to understand why the gods had forsaken them. Other coastal points soon followed. The Portuguese built forts at Axum, Shama, and Accra, transforming the once proud coastline into a corridor of sorrow. And with each ship that left the Gold Coast chained with human cargo, the heart of the land weakened. Tash local participation and moral dilemmas. It would be a lie to say that the transatlantic slave trade was a crime committed by Europeans alone. Some African leaders, seeking power or wealth, actively participated. Chiefs who once measured status by land and lineage now counted guns and foreign goods. Entire kingdoms rose and fell on the backs of the enslaved. For example, the Kwame Kingdom, located east of the Volta River, grew rich and powerful by controlling trade routes and participating in the slave trade. Their dominance was built not just on strategy, but on the ability to deliver captives to European buyers. But this participation came with consequences. Over time, trust within communities eroded. Chiefs became suspicious of their own subjects. Families lived in fear of being betrayed by neighbors. African society, once rooted in communal support and kinship, began to fracture. Yet not all yielded. Some leaders resisted. In certain towns, elders forbade the selling of their people. Secret societies worked to free captives or hide vulnerable villagers. Oral traditions tell of chiefs who refused bribes, who spat at European traders, or who cursed the castles built on their soil. But resistance was dangerous, and often fatal. Those taken from the Gold Coast faced a terrifying voyage across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage. Packed into the dark holds of slave ships like cargo, men and women lay chained side by side, unable to move, breathe, or even relieve themselves with dignity. Disease spread rapidly. The stench was unbearable. Despair took lives before the ocean did. Historians estimate that over 12 million Africans were taken across the Atlantic during the transatlantic slave trade. Millions more died in wars, in capture, in dungeons, or during the voyage. The Gold Coast, with its golden soil and rich culture, became one of the main funnels through which these souls were stolen. A people enduring. And yet, the Gold Coast did not fall apart. Even as villages were razed and hearts were broken, the spirit of the people endured. New kingdoms like Asante rose to prominence in the 1700s, built on military discipline, cultural pride, and political brilliance. In time, some states would try to control or restrict slave trade activities. Others would prepare for the growing threat of European conquest. But the damage had already been done. Generations were lost, communities weakened, trust shaken. Still, in the drums, in the dances, in the stories passed down around evening fires, the people remembered who they were. They would not be defined by the chains, but by how they broke them. Legacy and reflection. Today, the castles still stand, Elmina, Cape Coast, and others, silent and cold. Tourists walk their halls and try to imagine the screams, but the walls remember. They hold stories in their stones, whispers of those who walked through the door of no return, but whose descendants found a way to return. The slave trade did not just steal people, it stole knowledge, creativity, leadership, and time. But it could not erase memory. And from memory would rise new resistance. As the centuries turned, the Gold Coast would soon find itself battling not just foreign traders, but entire empires. The fight for dignity was far from over. Part 4. The Ashanti Rise and the Web of Power. Echoes of the Gold Coast, a journey through time. The dawn of the 18th century on the Gold Coast brought a fresh surge of ambition. not from the European forts clustered along the shore, but from deep within the forested interior. There, amidst the tall trees and sacred groves, a kingdom was rising. It was no ordinary state. It was a fierce federation bound by blood, belief, and brilliance. The Ashanti Empire, fierce, strategic, and proud, was ready to change the tides of history. The sacred beginning, a golden stool is born. Long before it was called an empire, the Ashanti were a confederation of Akan clans who had migrated from the savannas of the north and settled in the forest belts of present-day central Ghana. By the late 1600s, they were under the control of a more dominant kingdom, Denkira. But as pressure mounted, the Ashanti people yearned for unity. A spiritual call echoed across the land. Enter Okomfo Anoke, a mystic priest of immense power and wisdom, and Osei Tutu, a bold and charismatic military leader. Together, they forged the foundations of a kingdom, not just with weapons, but with symbolism. In a dramatic and unforgettable ceremony, Okomfo Anoke summoned the golden stool said to have descended from the heavens. It was no mere seat. It symbolized the soul of the Ashanti people, their unity, power, and destiny. It would never touch the ground and never be sat upon by any mortal. And with it, Osei Tutu became the first Asante Hene, the king of all Ashanti. A kingdom had been born, not through conquest alone, but through shared belief, warrior diplomacy, breaking the chains of Denkira. Denkira, once the Ashanti's overlord, was not pleased. They underestimated the newfound unity and spirit of rebellion among their former vassals. But Osei Tutu had a plan. With disciplined warriors, iron weapons, and divine backing, the Ashanti launched a fierce campaign in 1701. The Battle of Fayus was decisive. Denkira's army was shattered and its king captured. The Ashanti's victory was not just military, it was symbolic. It signaled the beginning of a new era. No longer under Denkira's yoke, the Ashanti began absorbing other Akan states into their fold. Kumawu, Juaben, Bekwai, and others, forming a powerful confederation. But conquest was only part of the story. The Ashanti used marriage alliances, rituals, festivals, and economic networks to cement unity. At the heart of it all was Kumasi, a city of palaces, marketplaces, and shrines, a symbol of Ashanti pride and governance. A kingdom of laws and layers. What made the Ashanti exceptional wasn't just their military strength, it was their political system. The Ashanti Empire operated as a federal structure. While the Asantehene sat atop the hierarchy, individual chiefs ruled their regions with autonomy but allegiance. They met at the Asantemanyamu, a kind of national council, to deliberate on wars, treaties, and laws. Justice was central. Disputes were settled in layered courts. Governance was not absolute. Chiefs could be distooled, removed for corruption or failure. The Ashanti revered law, custom, and accountability long before colonial systems claimed these ideals. And it worked. By the mid-1700s, the Ashanti were the most powerful force in the interior, controlling trade routes, rivers, and vast territories stretching into present-day Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso. Gold, kente, and pride. Economically, the Ashanti flourished. Their land was rich in gold, which they mined, refined, and traded. They crafted intricate jewelry, ceremonial swords, and ornaments that dazzled both locals and Europeans. Kumasi became a magnet for traders, not just for gold, but for kente cloth, kola nuts, salt, ivory, and cattle. Ashanti artisans were legendary. They developed Adinkra symbols, each carrying profound meanings: wisdom, bravery, humility, strength. These were carved into stools, stamped on cloth, and taught to children as part of moral education. This was a society of thinkers, doers, and warriors, a beacon of African statecraft. Tangled with the slave trade. Despite their brilliance, the Ashanti could not resist the currents of the time. The transatlantic slave trade still dominated West African economies, and the Ashanti, like many others, participated. They raided rival territories, captured prisoners, and sold them to European traders. Slave markets operated alongside gold trading posts. The Ashanti used the profits to buy guns, gunpowder, and luxuries, further enhancing their power. But they did not deal with Europeans blindly. The Ashanti were calculating. They demanded fair prices, challenged deceitful merchants, and often dictated terms of trade. At times, they even barred slave traders from entering their lands directly, preferring to control the flow through coastal intermediaries. Theirs was not a submissive posture, it was shrewd and self-interested. Yet with each trade, they too contributed to the human cost that had begun to scar the land. Sharp European tensions and first clashes. The Ashanti's rise threatened not just their African neighbors, but the European powers who had grown comfortable dealing with fragmented states. The British, Dutch, and Danes watched uneasily as the Ashanti extended their influence toward the coast. Conflict was inevitable. The Ashanti's interest in securing access to the coast brought them into frequent confrontation with the Fante Confederacy, a coastal alliance that had allied itself with the British. The Fante, though disunited, had strong British backing, and so the Ashanti-Fante Wars began, a long series of bloody battles stretching from the late 1700s into the 1800s. These were not just tribal conflicts. They were proxy wars between African states and European powers, with trade, pride, and survival at stake. Kumasi, the city of splendor and fear. At its peak, Kumasi was described by European visitors as more impressive than many European towns of the time. Its streets were wide. The royal palace, built of timber and mud, was richly adorned with gold and sacred stools. The city teemed with blacksmiths, weavers, priests, and musicians. Ceremonies were frequent. The Adai festival drew thousands. But the Ashanti were also feared. Their army was massive, well-trained, and disciplined. Their punishments were swift and brutal. The people were deeply spiritual, guided by the ancestral spirits and protected by Asafo warriors and mystical relics. The message was clear. Ashanti was not to be underestimated. The British advance. By the early 19th century, British ambitions on the Gold Coast had grown. They wanted not just trade, but dominion. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 forced the British to shift strategies. They now pursued legitimate trade in palm oil, cocoa, and minerals, but also political control. They began interfering in local affairs, arming allies, and setting up treaties that eroded African sovereignty. The Ashanti saw the writing on the wall. Under kings like Osei Bonsu, Kwaku Dua, and later Kofi Karakari, they resisted British advances, defended their allies, and fought for dominance. But even the mighty Ashanti could not forever stand against the tide of empire. Legacy in motion. As the 1800s wore on, the Ashanti's power would be tested like never before. Their capital would be invaded, their pride insulted, their golden stool threatened, yet their legacy endured. The Ashanti were a shining example of African self-determination, statecraft, and resilience. They were not a people to be pitied, but to be remembered with reverence. Their story is not just part of Ghana's history, it is central to the African narrative of resistance, innovation, and cultural pride. Next, Part 5, Clash of Ambitions, the British and the Ashanti. The Ashanti Empire had risen into a formidable force, and though they sat inland, away from the ocean, their presence loomed large even over the Europeans with their grand forts. At the heart of the growing hostility was a clash of ambition between two very different worldviews. On one side stood the Ashanti, proud, organized, and guided by a spiritual connection to the golden stool and the spirits of their ancestors. On the other, the British, calculated, imperial, and increasingly aggressive in their desire to control both commerce and governance across the region. The peace between them was like a frayed rope, tenuous and destined to snap, a rising tide of trouble. After the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, Britain had shifted focus to legitimate trade, palm oil, timber, and minerals. The Gold Coast, rich in natural resources, became central to this new vision. But their economic ventures were constantly obstructed by inland conflicts, especially between the Ashanti and the Fante Confederacy, who occupied the coast and had become allies of the British. The Ashanti, for their part, believed they had every right to collect tolls and assert dominance over Fante towns. After all, they had fought, beaten, and absorbed many of them into their empire. But the British, watching closely, saw these actions as violations of their trading security. By 1823, the relationship was deteriorating fast. The First Anglo-Ashanti War. It was the British governor, Sir Charles McCarthy, who made the fatal miscalculation. Assuming the Ashanti would retreat, at the sight of British might, he led a small force into the interior in 1824 to assert dominance. But he underestimated the Ashanti's preparedness and, more importantly, their resolve. At the Battle of Nensamankau, McCarthy's forces were completely routed. Over 100 British and Allied soldiers were killed. McCarthy himself was beheaded, and his skull was allegedly used as a drinking cup, a brutal symbol of Ashanti defiance. The defeat sent shockwaves through Britain, but the Ashanti's victory only delayed the inevitable. Cycles of war and uneasy peace. The First Anglo-Ashanti War was followed by a series of conflicts that would span nearly a century. Each war built on the memory of the last. Blood for blood, insult for insult. Treaties were signed and broken. Trade was interrupted. And the British, unable to tolerate what they saw as an uncivilized challenge to their control, increased their military presence. The Second Anglo-Ashanti War came in 1863, triggered by border disputes and attacks by Ashanti allies. This conflict, however, ended in a draw, largely due to the toll of tropical diseases on the British forces. But this stalemate only deepened Britain's resolve. Kumasi, the heart of the Ashanti Kingdom, became a target. The March to Kumasi. In 1873, after several decades of tension, trade disputes, and intermittent skirmishes, the British launched a full-scale military expedition aimed at the destruction of Ashanti power. Led by Sir Garnet Wolseley, British troops, now equipped with modern rifles, artillery, and logistical support, marched north toward Kumasi. The Ashanti, under Asante Kofi Karakari, fought valiantly, but their weapons were no match for British firepower. In February 1874, British troops entered Kumasi. The city was looted and burned. Palaces, shrines, and symbols of Ashanti pride were desecrated. The sacred golden stool, however, remained hidden, protected by the priests and guardians of the realm. The British imposed the Treaty of Fomena, forcing the Ashanti to pay heavy reparations, abandon claims to the southern territories, and cease their attempts to control coastal trade routes. It seemed that Ashanti power had been broken, but not their spirit. The return of the lioness. For nearly 3 decades after the burning of Kumasi, the Ashanti tried to navigate a new reality. Though they had been defeated militarily, they remained internally governed. British control was largely limited to the coast and a few trade routes. But in 1896, another wave of confrontation began. The British, seeking total control of the interior, arrested and exiled Asante Prempeh to Seychelles. The empire was left leaderless, but not defenseless. In 1900, the British made a critical mistake. Governor Sir Frederick Hodgson demanded that the sacred golden stool, the symbol of Ashanti unity and spiritual authority, be surrendered to him. To the Ashanti, this was not just insulting, it was blasphemous. And from the shadows of history, a fierce woman rose to lead. Ya Asantewa, the Queen Mother of Ejisu, rallied the people with fiery words. If you men will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight. Under her command, the Ashanti laid siege to the British fort in Kumasi for several months. Though they were ultimately defeated and Ya Asantewa was captured and exiled, her defiance became legendary. She was the last to lead an armed Ashanti resistance. The War of 1900 marked the final military conflict between the Ashanti and the British. In 1901, the British formally annexed the Ashanti territories into the Gold Coast colony. The Ashanti Empire as an independent force was over. But Ya Asantewa had lit a flame, one that would burn quietly for decades, until it grew into the fire of freedom. The golden stool was never captured, never sat upon by foreign hands, and never desecrated. The people held their traditions close, passed their stories down, and waited. They waited as the British built railways and schools, as cocoa replaced palm oil as the colony's cash crop, and as foreign governance reshaped native institutions. But even as Union Jacks flew over forts and markets, even as European governors signed decrees and imposed taxes, the whisper of the past remained. The Ashanti and many other ethnic groups across the Gold Coast remembered their kings and queens, their gods and heroes, their victories and their wounds. And in that memory, the seeds of nationhood took root. Part 6, Fire and Ashes, The Fall of Kumasi and the Aftermath. Echoes of the Gold Coast, A Journey Through Time. The year was 1901. The sacred city of Kumasi, once the roaring capital of the Ashanti Empire, now sat in uneasy silence. Its palaces had been burned, its leaders exiled, and its independence officially stripped by the British crown. Yet, in the silence of its carved stools and echoing courtyards, a whisper lingered, of honor not lost, of pride not dead. The Ashanti Uprising of 1900, led by the indomitable Ya Asantewa, had been the final act of defiance. Although it ended in defeat, it shattered British assumptions that African resistance had waned. The Queen Mother of Ejisu had shown that the spirit of resistance burned just as fiercely in women as it did in men. Her war, her courage, and her words would leave an enduring legacy. But with her defeat, a new era dawned. Not one of peace, but of strategic submission, cultural reformation, and a gradual shift toward indirect rule. This was the era where power burned beneath the surface, where revolution simmered quietly, waiting for its moment to erupt. Past the formal annexation, Guinea II, the British Parliament officially declared the Ashanti territories part of the Gold Coast colony. This annexation was more than just symbolic. It meant the loss of any formal autonomy for the Asante Kingdom. Yet interestingly, the British chose not to destroy the Ashanti system entirely. The British understood that traditional structures had deep roots, and uprooting them could destabilize the very order they hoped to control. So rather than dismantle the Ashanti chieftaincy, they worked to co-opt it. The Ashanti Kingdom would continue to exist, but under British oversight, without a reigning Asante King for many years. This marked the start of what the British called indirect rule, a system of shadows. Under indirect rule, British administrators governed through local chiefs and councils. The aim was to use existing traditional systems to enforce colonial policies, tax collection, legal codes, education, and more. It was a clever strategy. It gave the illusion of autonomy while allowing the British to keep control. However, the policy had mixed consequences. In some areas, it preserved local traditions and languages. In others, it weakened traditional leadership by turning chiefs into colonial functionaries. In many cases, the system fueled tribal rivalries, as some groups were favored over others. In Ashanti territory, some leaders cooperated, others resisted quietly. But no one forgot the burning of Kumasi. The image of the golden stool hidden from foreign hands remained a symbol of spiritual resistance. Meanwhile, life across the broader Gold Coast was changing rapidly. The rise of cocoa and economic transformation. While the flames of resistance cooled in the interior, along the coast and forest belt, an entirely different revolution was brewing, an agricultural one. In the late 19th century, an enterprising farmer named Tere Korshi returned from the island of Fernando Po, modern-day Bioko in Equatorial Guinea, with a handful of cocoa pods. He planted them in Mampong Aqua Pim, and they thrived. By the early 20th century, cocoa had transformed the economy of the Gold Coast. It overtook palm oil and timber to become the main export crop. Thousands of smallholder farmers planted cocoa across the southern forests, and within decades, the colony became the world's largest cocoa producer. This had profound effects. It created a new, rural middle class. It increased the flow of money and investment into African hands. It connected farming communities to global markets. It built the economic backbone for what would eventually become a modern nationalist movement. Ironically, British colonial rule meant to suppress had inadvertently empowered many Gold Coasters economically. But political empowerment was still distant. New roads, new schools, new systems. To support the growing economy, the British invested heavily in infrastructure. Railways linked the interior to coastal ports. Roads were constructed to connect villages to urban centers. Towns like Accra, Sekondi, and Cape Coast grew in size and influence. But perhaps more transformative was the spread of Western-style education. Missionaries, especially from the Methodist, Presbyterian, and Anglican churches, opened schools across the colony. Young boys and eventually girls learned English, arithmetic, scripture, and British history. Some were trained as clerks, teachers, or pastors. Others became interpreters and civil servants in the colonial government. A new class was emerging, the educated elite. This group would soon start to ask questions the British weren't ready to answer. Why should we serve but never lead? Why should we learn but never govern? The national consciousness awakens. By the 1920s, whispers of nationalism were echoing in the classroom, the pulpit, and the cocoa farms. The colony had been pacified, but it was no longer sleeping. Beneath the surface, a new Gold Coast was forming, one not defined by tribal kings or colonial governors, but by a common yearning for self-determination. Educated Africans began forming associations and debating clubs where issues of governance, racial equality, and political rights were discussed. Influential figures like J.E. Casely Hayford, a lawyer and journalist, began advocating for African rights and unity. In 1920, Casely Hayford helped form the National Congress of British West Africa, NCBWA, the first organized political movement advocating for the rights of West Africans under British rule. Though the movement struggled to influence British policy, it laid the foundation for future activism. It was becoming clear the days of silent submission were ending. The return of the Ashanti monarchy. In a remarkable turn of history, the British began to reconsider their treatment of the Ashanti monarchy. In 1924, after nearly 30 years in exile, Asante Kingdom was allowed to return to Kumasi. Though not immediately restored to full kingship, he was welcomed with immense joy. He returned not as a warrior king, but as a symbol of unity. In 1935, his successor, Otumfuo Osei Ajiman Prempeh Seke, was officially recognized as the Asante Hini, marking the formal restoration of the Ashanti Confederacy. While the region remained part of the Gold Coast colony, this restoration had massive symbolic weight. It rekindled the Ashanti identity, strengthened traditional governance, and reinforced the sense that the Gold Coast was not a colony of strangers, but a land of people with memory, heritage, and a vision of their own. World War II and the changing world order. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 would further transform the Gold Coast. Thousands of Gold Coasters were recruited into the British armed forces, fighting in East Africa, Burma, and beyond. Many returned home with new perspectives, having seen the hypocrisy of colonialism up close. They had fought for freedom abroad, only to return to a homeland where they were denied the very rights they defended. At home, the war disrupted global trade, triggered inflation, and exposed the fragility of colonial economic systems. Strikes, protests, and price riots broke out. The British, facing war in Europe and unrest in the colonies, began to rethink their imperial strategies. By 1945, the world was no longer the same, and the Gold Coast, smarter, more organized, and increasingly defiant, was ready for something greater. Closing reflections of Part 6. The fall of Kumasi did not mark the end of Ashanti glory. It marked the beginning of something far greater, a national transformation. Colonial rule, with all its steel and statutes, could not erase history. Instead, it set the stage for a different kind of revolution. One fought not with swords, but with pens, voices, ballots, and dreams. The ashes of Kumasi fertilized the soil of change. Out of it rose the cocoa farmer with political ideas, the schoolboy who would become a president, and the teacher who would write the songs of a new nation. Part 7, Shackles and Scripts, the birth of colonial rule and the path to protest. The mid-20th century in the Gold Coast was a time of contradictions. Roads and railways expanded, schools flourished, cocoa money flowed, but freedom, real freedom, remained distant. Every gain came with chains. Every promise came wrapped in rules. As the cocoa-rich lands fed the British economy and African children memorized Shakespeare in mission schools, a question began to take root in the minds of ordinary people. If we can grow the wealth, build the roads, and teach the children, why can't we lead ourselves? This was the question that birthed a new kind of battle, not in the forests or the forts, but in newspapers, lecture halls, courtrooms, and city streets. A battle where the most powerful weapons were words, ideas, and organization. Colonial governance, order, or oppression. After World War II, British colonial policy began to shift, but not quickly enough for the people of the Gold Coast. The colonial structure remained top-heavy. At the top sat the governor, appointed by the Crown, with a legislative council composed mainly of British officials and a handful of appointed African representatives. Local governance remained in the hands of chiefs, but their authority was limited to what the colonial administration allowed. In theory, the system offered representation. In practice, it reinforced British control. Africans could vote, but only a tiny fraction of the population met the qualifications. They could speak, but only in the spaces allowed. They could petition, but only on British terms. The educated elite, especially lawyers, journalists, and teachers, grew increasingly frustrated with this system. These were men and women who had studied abroad, passed British exams, and returned to serve their country, only to find themselves sidelined from real power. In the absence of political platforms, newspapers became the new battleground for resistance. Publications like the Gold Coast Spectator, the Times of West Africa, and the African Morning Post carried sharp editorials questioning colonial policies, calling for reform, and demanding rights. Writers and editors used coded language to criticize British hypocrisy, praising the empire's values, while highlighting how those values weren't applied to its African subjects. One of the most influential journalists of the time was Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, a Nigerian who spent time in Accra working as the editor of the African Morning Post. Though Nigerian, his ideas spread widely across West Africa. He preached Pan-Africanism, racial pride, and political self-determination. His writings would inspire a young teacher named Kwame Nkrumah. The educated elite, new leaders emerge. From the ashes of indirect rule and colonial exclusion, a new generation of leaders began to rise. One of them was J.B. Dankwa, a lawyer educated in the UK and a key intellectual figure in the Gold Coast. He wrote extensively about the need for political representation, constitutional reform, and national pride. In 1947, he helped form the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC, a political party aimed at pushing for self-government in the shortest possible time. The UGCC attracted a blend of intellectuals, professionals, and businessmen, but the movement needed energy, mass appeal, and charisma. So they reached out to a young man studying in the United States, a former seminary student turned radical thinker, Kwame Nkrumah. The return of Kwame Nkrumah. In 1947, Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast and was appointed General Secretary of the UGCC. At first, he seemed like the perfect match, a brilliant orator, politically sharp, and deeply committed to African liberation. But it quickly became clear that Nkrumah and the UGCC founders had different visions. While Dankwa and his colleagues pushed for gradual reform, Nkrumah demanded immediate independence. Where the UGCC leaned toward middle-class respectability, Nkrumah reached out to farmers, laborers, students, and the unemployed. He wanted a mass movement. The 1948 Accra riots, the fire ignites. In February 1948, a group of ex-servicemen, Gold Coasters who had fought for the British in World War II, marched peacefully through Accra to present a petition to the governor. They wanted pensions, compensation, and dignity. Instead, they were met with gunfire. 3 ex-soldiers were shot dead near the Christiansborg Castle. The city exploded in rage. Over the next days, shops were looted, offices burned, and colonial symbols attacked. The British panicked and declared a state of emergency. In a controversial move, they arrested the leaders of the UGCC, including Nkrumah, calling them the Big Six. But the arrests backfired. Far from silencing the protests, they turned the UGCC leaders into heroes, and among them, Nkrumah emerged as the most electrifying figure. The birth of the CPP, a party of the people. By 1949, it was clear Nkrumah could no longer remain in the UGCC. His vision had outgrown the party's cautious pace. He broke away and founded the Convention People's Party, CPP. The CPP was a different breed of political movement. It wasn't just a party, it was a revolution. Its slogan, self-government now. Its symbol, the red cockerel crowing at dawn. Its base, students, market women, workers, cocoa farmers, and the urban poor. Nkrumah toured the country tirelessly, speaking in local languages, organizing rallies, and promising a new dawn. And the people listened. In 1950, the CPP launched a positive action campaign, a series of strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience aimed at forcing the colonial government to grant full political rights. The British responded by jailing Nkrumah, but the CPP kept growing. And when elections were finally held in 1951, the people made their voice clear. Nkrumah won, while still in prison. From prison to prime minister, Nkrumah's victory stunned the British. Never before had a colony seen such a mass political uprising. Faced with growing unrest and international pressure, the colonial authorities released him. He was appointed leader of government business in 1951, later becoming the Prime Minister of the Gold Coast. Though still technically under British rule, the colony now had an African government at its helm. Nkrumah worked rapidly, building schools, expanding infrastructure, and preparing the country for full independence. But tensions remained. Some feared that Nkrumah's style was too radical. Others worried that he was moving too fast. Yet nothing could stop the tide now. The people were awake. The dream of freedom, nurtured in secret for centuries, was about to be realized. Part 8, Independence Now, The Road to Ghana's Birth, of the Gold Coast, A Journey Through Time. The year is 1951. The streets of Accra are alive with chants. Children sing Nkrumah's name. Women in the markets wear cloths stamped with red cockerels. Farmers in cocoa villages speak of a future they once thought impossible. From prison to power, Kwame Nkrumah has risen like a storm. But the dream is not yet complete. The Gold Coast has a prime minister, yes, but not independence. The Union Jack still flies above the castle. The final battle for sovereignty for the soul of a people is just beginning, and the whole world is watching. The CPP in power, from protest to governance. Kwame Nkrumah's release from prison was met with thunderous celebrations across the colony. As leader of government business, he now had partial control of internal affairs, but defense, finance, and foreign policy remained firmly in British hands. Still, it was a monumental shift. He moved swiftly to show what African self-governance could look like. Education. Massive expansion of schools across the colony with free basic education and new teacher training colleges. Infrastructure. Construction of roads, hospitals, water systems, and rural development projects. Jobs. Creation of public work programs to reduce unemployment and train skilled workers. Political awareness. The CPP built grassroots structures, holding meetings in towns, villages, and even cocoa farms. Yet, these victories weren't without resistance. Opposition rises, unity under threat. Not everyone was on board with Nkrumah's vision. In the Ashanti region, many felt alienated by the central government. The National Liberation Movement, NLM, formed in 1954, calling for a federal system where regions would retain more autonomy. Their slogan, "We prefer self-government in unity to self-government in disunity," spoke to a growing fear that Nkrumah's centralized power could turn into authoritarianism. In the Northern Territories, chiefs were wary of Southern dominance. In Yu-speaking areas, divided by colonial borders, calls for reunification with British Togoland added complexity to national unity. And in elite circles, some of the UGCC founders, like J.B. Dankwa, began to publicly criticize Nkrumah's methods. Despite the noise, the people remained largely with the CPP. The 1954 and 1956 elections, the people speak. To answer critics and satisfy the British, a new constitution was introduced in 1954. It expanded African control of government, and general elections were held. The results, CPP won 71 out of 104 seats. Nkrumah was appointed prime minister, this time with greater powers than before. Still, the British insisted, let's see if they're serious about independence. So in 1956, another election was held. Once again, the CPP won by a landslide. The people had spoken for the third time. This was no longer a gamble or a phase. We are not asking for independence, we are demanding it, Nkrumah, and the British could no longer deny it. Togoland and unity confirmed. One final hurdle remained, British Togoland. Under UN supervision, a plebiscite was held to determine whether the territory would join the Gold Coast or remain separate. The majority voted for integration. It was a symbolic and strategic victory. It showed the world that this new nation would be united, not fragmented. All the pieces were in place. March 6, 1957, a nation is born. The drums started days before the event. From every corner of the colony, people made the journey to Accra on foot, by lorry, by canoe. They came not just for the ceremony, but to witness history. The old polo grounds were packed. As midnight approached, the lights dimmed. Nkrumah, dressed in a flowing white smock and sandals, stood tall before the crowd. A single sentence split the sky. At long last, the battle has ended, and thus Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. The crowd erupted. Tears flowed, drums thundered, men danced, women ululated, children lit sparklers, fireworks painted the night. The Gold Coast was no more. In its place rose Ghana, named after the ancient West African Empire, a symbol of African strength, pride, and possibility. Why Ghana? Nkrumah and the intellectuals around him chose the name Ghana deliberately. It harkened back to the Empire of Ghana, a powerful medieval African kingdom in what is now modern-day Mali and Mauritania. By invoking that legacy, Nkrumah was making a statement. We are not a new people. We are a reborn people. He was rejecting the idea that Africa was a blank slate before colonization. Ghana, he claimed, was the first black African nation to break colonial chains in modern times and would become a beacon for others. International reactions. Hope and suspicion. World leaders watched Ghana's independence closely. The West saw Ghana as a test case. Could Africans really govern themselves? The USSR saw potential for ideological alignment. Other African nations saw Ghana as the trailblazer, proof that colonial rule could be challenged. Even Martin Luther King Jr. attended the independence celebration, returning to the U.S. deeply inspired. In his sermons, he often mentioned Ghana as a metaphor for black liberation, but with independence came great pressure, and Nkrumah knew it. The first cabinet, a dream team, Nkrumah assembled a cabinet of loyalists and visionaries. Komla Agbeli Bedema, Minister of Finance; Kojo Batsio, Minister of Foreign Affairs; Kofi Bako, Minister of Information; Tawia Demafio, Minister of the Interior. Their mission was ambitious: build a new nation from the ashes of colonial bureaucracy. They faced urgent challenges, unifying a diverse population of over 100 ethnic groups, managing resources without British aid, defining foreign policy in a world split by the Cold War. Yet the energy was palpable. A people once written off by history were now writing their own. Nkrumah's vision, beyond Ghana. From day one, Nkrumah saw Ghana not as an island, but as the start of a movement. His dream was not just Ghana's independence, but the liberation of all of Africa. He poured resources into training young African leaders, supporting freedom fighters in other colonies, and building the foundation for a United States of Africa. Some admired his boldness, others warned he was overreaching. Still, Nkrumah pressed on. Part 9. The Flame and the Fall, Ghana After Independence. Echoes of the Gold Coast, A Journey Through Time. The morning after freedom, March 7th, 1957, Ghana woke to a new dawn. Church bells rang. Mosques echoed with prayers. People danced in the streets. The Union Jack had been lowered, and in its place, the red, gold, green, and black star waved proudly over the land. The weight of colonialism had lifted, but what came next would test the spirit of a young nation. Ghana's independence was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a complex new chapter filled with hope, vision, missteps, and resilience. At its center stood Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the African Messiah, now Prime Minister of a sovereign state. He promised not just freedom, but transformation. A nation's blueprint, the 7-year plan. Nkrumah's post-independence vision was grand. We must build an industrialized, self-reliant economy. We must lead Africa in unity and innovation. In 1961, his government launched the 7-year development plan, a massive economic agenda aimed at shifting Ghana from a primarily agrarian society to an industrial giant. Key pillars of the plan: industrialization, construction of factories for textiles, steel, sugar, and automobiles; agricultural mechanization, introduction of modern tools to boost cocoa, maize, and rice production; infrastructure expansion, roads, railways, ports, and housing schemes across the country; education, opening of technical schools, universities, and scholarships for science and engineering; energy, construction of the Akasambo Dam, intended to power industrial zones and surrounding countries. It was ambitious, some would say revolutionary, but it was also expensive. The Akasambo Dam, a dream of power. One of Nkrumah's most symbolic and strategic projects was the Volta River Project, specifically the construction of the Akasambo Dam. With U.S. support through the Kaiser Aluminum Company and funding from the World Bank, construction began in 1961. The dam would create Lake Volta, one of the largest man-made lakes in the world, and power the Valco aluminum smelter. The project was hailed as a triumph of African ambition. But it also came at a cost. Over 80,000 people were displaced from their ancestral lands. Massive resources were diverted from agriculture. Environmental shifts affected fishing and farming in unexpected ways. Still, by 1965, the dam was completed, lighting homes, factories, and dreams across Ghana. A global voice in Nkrumah's foreign policy. At home, Nkrumah was building a nation. Abroad, he was building a continent. He became the loudest voice for Pan-Africanism, pushing for the political and economic unification of Africa. Nkrumah's Global Steps founded the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963, opened embassies and cultural centers across Africa and beyond, supported liberation movements in Algeria, Congo, Angola, and South Africa, called for a non-aligned movement, neither East nor West, but African first. But critics began to ask, was he spending too much time saving the continent and not enough solving Ghana's problems? Cracks in the wall, economic and political pressures. By the mid-1960s, Ghana's economy was in trouble. Economic strains, falling cocoa prices, Ghana's lifeblood cut deeply into national revenue, rising debt from infrastructure and industrial projects, increasing inflation, shortages, and unemployment. To manage this, Nkrumah introduced austerity measures, cuts in wages, rationing, and import controls. The public, once jubilant, grew frustrated. Simultaneously, Nkrumah's style of governance began to shift towards a one-party state. In 1964, Nkrumah declared Ghana a one-party state. One party for one nation, he said. We cannot afford disunity in a revolutionary period. Critics saw it differently. He banned opposition parties, censored the press, and expanded the powers of the security services. Dissenters were arrested under the Preventive Detention Act, often without trial. Among those imprisoned were former allies and respected voices like J.B. Dankwa and Kofi Abrefa-Bizia. Nkrumah was no longer just a prime minister. In 1960, he had become president for life. What had begun as a people's movement was now looking like a cult of personality. His face adorned billboards, books, even currency. Assassination attempts and growing paranoia. As opposition mounted, so did threats to Nkrumah's life. Between 1962 and 1965, there were multiple assassination attempts. In one incident, a bomb exploded near him in Kulungugu, killing school children and wounding others. These attacks hardened Nkrumah's stance. He grew paranoid and distrustful, surrounding himself with loyalists and secret police. Rumors spread of informants in every neighborhood. The vibrant democracy the CPP once promised had dimmed, and behind closed doors, whispers of change began to echo within the military. The 1966 coup. On February 24, 1966, while Nkrumah was on a peace mission in Vietnam, a group of military and police officers, calling themselves the National Liberation Council, NLC, seized control of the country. Their broadcast was blunt. Fellow citizens, we have taken over the government in the name of the people. Crowds poured into the streets, toppling Nkrumah's statues, burning CPP flags, and chanting against the man they once called Osagyefo, the Redeemer. The NLC accused Nkrumah of economic mismanagement, suppression of freedoms, misguided foreign policy. For Nkrumah, it was a heartbreaking betrayal. He never returned to Ghana again. Life in exile, from revolutionary to recluse. Exiled in Conakry, Guinea, Nkrumah was welcomed by President Sékou Touré, who named him honorary co-president. There, he wrote books, offered advice to African leaders, and lamented the state of the continent. His final years were marked by illness, isolation, and regret. In 1972, he died in Romania after treatment for cancer. He was 62. The legacy of a giant. Though he fell from power, Nkrumah's influence never truly disappeared. His ideas would inspire movements for Black empowerment around the world, the rise of African liberation across Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and beyond. Calls for African unity and dignity that still echo today. Even his critics acknowledge his role in ending colonial rule and igniting the Pan-African flame. In time, Ghana would reclaim his legacy, repatriating his body, building a mausoleum, and honoring him as the father of the nation. Part 10. A Nation Reborn, Ghana's Journey from Crisis to Stability. Echoes of the Gold Coast, A Journey Through Time. February 1966. The euphoria of the coup that ousted Kwame Nkrumah quickly turned into uncertainty. Ghana was now led by the National Liberation Council, NLC, a military government headed by Lieutenant General Joseph Arthur Ankra. Their mission was to restore democracy and economic stability. But the challenges were enormous. Nkrumah's grand infrastructure projects had left massive national debts. The state-run enterprises intended to industrialize the nation were underperforming or defunct. Inflation soared and unemployment surged. The NLC turned to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank for help. In return, they had to dismantle state-owned businesses, liberalize the economy, and cut public spending. These policies, though intended to stabilize the economy, deepened the hardship for many Ghanaians. The return to civilian rule, Bizia's brief sunrise. In 1969, Ghana made its way back to civilian governance. A new constitution was drafted, political parties returned, elections were held. The Progress Party, PP, led by Dr. Kofi Abrefa Bizia, won decisively. He became prime minister with Edward Akufo-Addo as ceremonial president. Bizia's tenure, however, was brief and burdened. Though he introduced liberal reforms and promoted rural development through the Operation Feed Yourself program, his government struggled with foreign exchange shortages, rising cost of living, tensions with labor unions. In 1972, just 3 years after his election, Colonel Ignatius Kutuyampong led a bloodless coup, ending Ghana's Second Republic. Achimpong and the era of military experiments. Achimpong's regime, later consolidated under the Supreme Military Council (SMC), introduced a mix of populist and nationalist policies. His boldest move was Operation Feed Yourself, which encouraged local food production to reduce imports. He also repudiated parts of Ghana's foreign debt, arguing that loans used for useless prestige projects should not burden the people. But corruption flourished under the SMC. Confidence in the regime waned. By 1978, amid internal pressure, Achiempong was forced to resign and was replaced by Lieutenant General Fred Akufo. But stability remained elusive. Rawlings rises, the revolutionary youth. On June 4, 1979, a young Air Force officer, Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings, led a revolutionary coup. His fiery rhetoric targeted corruption and the elite's betrayal of the Ghanaian people. He launched the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, AFRC. The AFRC executed former heads of state, including Achiempong and Akufo, in a bid to cleanse the nation of corrupt leadership. While Rawlings relinquished power to a civilian government later that year, the Third Republic under President Hilla Liman, Ghana was still in turmoil. By 1981, Rawlings returned, this time for good. The PNDC era, Rawlings' long shadow. Second Coming marked the birth of the Provisional National Defense Council, PNDC, a military-led regime that would rule until 1992. His government was initially radical: community tribunals, people's defense committees, national mobilization programs. But the economy was in free fall. Faced with hyperinflation, food shortages, and a collapsed currency, Rawlings pivoted. He embraced economic reforms backed by the IMF and World Bank, a dramatic reversal from his revolutionary ideals. These reforms, part of the Structural Adjustment Program, helped stabilize the economy but came with privatization of public enterprises, layoffs in the public sector, cuts to education and health budgets. People suffered, even as GDP improved. The debate over whether Rawlings saved or strained Ghana still continues. Democracy reborn. The Fourth Republic. In 1992, under mounting pressure, Rawlings reintroduced multi-party democracy. A new constitution was approved. That year, he ran for president under the banner of the National Democratic Congress, NDC, and won. This marked the beginning of the Fourth Republic, Ghana's most enduring democratic era to date. Since then, Ghana has seen peaceful transfers of power between two major political parties, the NDC, founded by Rawlings, the New Patriotic Party, MEP, rooted in Dankwa Buzia tradition. Presidents like John Agyekum Kufuor, John Evans Atta Mills, John Dramani Mahama, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo have each added a page to Ghana's unfolding democratic story. Today, Ghana stands tall as one of Africa's most stable democracies, a leading voice in ECOWAS and African Union politics, a hub for African diasporans returning home through campaigns like Year of Return, 2019. Despite challenges like youth unemployment, economic inequality, and corruption, Ghana continues to rise. Its media is vibrant. Its civil society is active. Its elections are fiercely contested but peaceful. Ghana is often referred to as the Black Star of Africa. That star, once placed on a new flag in 1957, still burns with promise. The journey from the Gold Coast to Ghana is a tale of resilience. From ancient empires and colonial conquest through revolution and reform, coups and constitutions, Ghana's story is one of a people who refuse to be broken. It's the story of the Asante warrior, the Fante trader, the Ewe teacher, the Dagomba farmer, the Ga fisherman, and every child who grew up believing they could change the world. Final reflections. If the Gold Coast was the womb, then Ghana is the child, still growing, learning, stumbling, and rising. Its history reminds us that freedom is not a destination, but a daily effort. That nationhood is not just a flag or anthem, but a shared dream, fought for and renewed with every generation. As the national pledge declares, I promise on my honor to be faithful and loyal to Ghana, my motherland. The future is unwritten, but its roots are deep. And that, dear listener, is the story of Ghana, a tale still unfolding.